Hello, all. Welcome to another episode on the series of Hellenistic Astrology that I'm doing with Lars. Thank you, Lars, for joining. And this is, I think, Sect is going to be real fun.
Yeah,
And yeah, as it is, we have
definitely.
had a lot of discussion about Sect. So I
Cool.
think the best place to start by defining Sect.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm going to read a passage from Rhetorius's book. Rhetorius, the Egyptian, was the title he had. He was a Hellenistic astrologer, and his book is really a great treasure. If you can get a copy of it, I highly recommend it. So he says, in diurnal nativities, the Sun, Saturn, and Jupiter are rulers of the sect, but in nocturnal ones, the Moon, Venus, and Mars are ruler of the sect. For Mercury was appointed to be common to the sects. And that's pretty much all he says about sect in this opening section
Okay.
on the subject. And so, that brings us to what is sect. And that's basically whether you were born during the day or the night. So, Ashwin, can you share your screen and we can have a look at these diagrams?
Yeah, sure. One moment.
Cool.
Yeah. So we have the day chart here, and this is the wheel chart where we have the ascendant and the descendant. So when the sun is above the horizon, a chart is considered to be a day chart, and as you see, sun is below the horizon, that is below the ascendant descendant axis, and this is called as the night chart. So sect is a basic.
Right.
One moment, I'll just stop sharing the screen so that it will be easier for us to.
Okay, cool. And so, yeah, as you may have heard when I was reading, right, the terms diurnal and nocturnal were used, and that just refers to day and night.
Yeah.
And so we have two divisions of the planets in day and night, and it's a very simple concept. And as you could see in that diagram, right, the horizon line was bisecting the signs that it was in, right? So if it's in the middle of a sign, right, even if your sun was in the first house, it could be below the horizon. Or even if your sun was in the seventh house, right, it could be above the horizon or below it, and so on, setting, rising. So even if the sun is in one of those houses, you still have to see if it's above or below the horizon to determine, is the chart a day chart or a night chart? And then when you do that, basically the nocturnal, if it's a day chart, the day planets that we listed from Rhetorius, those will be emphasized in a certain way. And if it's a night chart, then the nocturnal planets that we mentioned from Rhetorius will be emphasized in a certain way. So, Ashwin, did you want to talk some more about that?
No, so getting back to what are the diurnal and nocturnal planets, I think we should also say why Saturn and Mars have been allocated as diurnal and nocturnal planets respectively. So,
Sure.
Sun is the leader of the day chart, while Moon is the leader of the night chart, and Jupiter is the most benefic planet uh, of the day chart, and Venus is the most benefic of the night chart, and Mars is the most malefic in the day chart, and Saturn is most malefic in the night chart. So basically, it is pretty easy to conclude saying that a planet prefers to be in its own sect, and it tends to be a little unhappy when it is placed out of its sect. So Jupiter tends to be happy when it's placed in a day chart, while Venus is more happy and more benefic when she's placed in a night chart. So
Right.
yeah, I think something is popping up. So okay, so yeah, so Chris Brennan has given a very good analysis saying that sect as a qualitative factor. So here, so I'll just read out a simple passage where he says, sect is primarily a qualitative factor that alters the benefic or malefic character of a planet in a chart, rather than a quantitative factor that alters how strong or prominent a planet is. So each planet prefers to be in a chart that matches its own sect, and when this is the case, the Hellenistic astrologers would sometimes use terms that describe the planets as being happier or rejoicing, when a planet finds itself in a chart that matches its preferred sect, it is to be of the sect or belonging to the sect. So, uh, so as I already said, diurnal planets prefer to be in a day chart, and nocturnal planets prefer to be in a night chart. So, would you like to talk about the
Right.
sect, right? Or do you have something
Yeah,
more?
sure. So, yeah, I'll just talk freely, I guess. So, like you were saying about the benefics, right? They get more benefic when they have sect, and the malefics get more constructive or less malefic when they have sect. And malefic benefic is kind of a harsh distinction, and so perhaps we'll have another video where we discuss that more philosophically. But for now, just bear with us if you're new to ancient astrology, and just grit your teeth and bear it if you're one of those people that doesn't like those terms. It's fine. We'll get to it later. But in any case, like, so Saturn will be more constructive during the day, Mars more constructive during the night, and then the reverse is true, as Ashwin mentioned, right? During the night, Saturn is less constructive, so he's more malefic, and during the day, Mars is less constructive and therefore more malefic. And basically, the reason for this we want to talk about why all the planets are why they fit into the sect the way they do. But let's start with the malefics. Basically, Saturn is naturally cold and dry and dark because he is the furthest planet away from the Earth and the sun that we can see, right? So he's furthest away. So he has this connotation, being furthest from the sun, of not being as illumined, not being as warm, and so on. So the idea was that symbolically the heat and light of the day balances Saturn's naturally cold and dark propensity. And then Mars, being the red planet, the fiery, aggressive planet, he gets balanced by the cool and dark qualities of the night. Kind of like when you have to you heat up tea and it's too hot and you like pour some cold water in it. It's kind of like that thing. And then likewise, do you have that quote from Ptolemy? Did you want to read that real quick? I think I lost your sound. I'm not hearing you.
How about now?
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Okay, so
All right. Mercury retrograde technical difficulties. We're
yes,
at
I've
the
been
very
facing this for past 1 week since Mercury already was retrograde. So things will happen, and
yeah. No
uh,
worries.
yeah. See, most of us tend to think that Mars is a diurnal planet and Saturn is a nocturnal planet because of their distance from the luminaries and other basic qualities. But what the Hellenistic astrologers have said is that Saturn is a diurnal planet and Mars is a nocturnal planet. And Claudius Ptolemy, the second century astrologer, has given a scientific rationale to support why Mars is a nocturnal planet and why Saturn is a diurnal planet. So he says in his Tetrabiblos that Saturn and Mars have not been allotted as diurnal and nocturnal, respectively, based upon the division of time, but based upon their nature. The diurnal planets already offer heat, and Saturn's coldness adds a counterbalancing effect, while Mars' dryness adds counterbalance to the moisture. So as it is, we have a lot of heat in the day with Sun and Jupiter being the diurnal planets, and Saturn's cold nature adds a counterbalancing effect, as Claudius Ptolemy has mentioned. And
Right.
in the night chart, Moon and Venus have already added enough cold and moisture, while Mars's dryness adds a counterbalancing effect to the nocturnal team. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's more of this kind of very basic elemental, and like it's still very symbolic to me because all of astrology is symbolic, and so again we're dealing with this symbolically all the time because it's not like because it's daytime Saturn literally gets heated up. That doesn't matter on a purely physical level, but it's a symbology kind of thing. And it's also interesting to note that Saturn and Jupiter are the two slowest moving planets, and partly because and they're at the outer reaches of our of our visible solar system, right? They're the outer reaches. So those two things make those two planets less personal, right? Because everyone born in one year is going to have Jupiter in the same sign, roughly speaking. Everyone born in about 2.5 years, right, is going to have Saturn in that same sign. So they're a bit more generational in that respect. Not fully generational, because a generation is not 2.5 or 1 years, but you get what I'm saying. They move less quickly, so they're less personal. And the symbology of the daytime always has to do esoterically with manifestation and activity and an extroverted centrifugal force of energy. So Jupiter and Saturn, Jupiter being expansive, he's power and expanse, and he reminds me of like he's sort of like the rays of the sun. He's that expansive heat that's coming off a flame, or the light that's coming off the sun, and heat and so on. And so he already has a very daytime symbology to him. But then this collective factor that I'm talking about, right? Saturn and Jupiter they're more impersonal, they're more collective, right? Saturn is those difficulties, or can represent the difficulties we experience, that we have less say over, and Jupiter represents the good things that come to us simply because of our good works and our faith, right? So they're more impersonal. And the sun too, the sun is always shining however it's shining, regardless of how we want it to shine or what we think it should shine as, in contrast to the moon, which goes through these 27, 28 phases, which represent the changing states of our mental, emotional self, so it's our moods and where our focus is. And that's a very subjective thing, in contrast to the sun, which is just shining on everything equally, friend and foe alike, and so on. So with the nocturnal planets, we have a contrast where Moon, Venus, and Mars are closer to the Earth than Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn are, right? We've got the Earth, and then we've got, Mars, Venus, and we've got the Moon circling around the Earth. So we kind of have this trinity of the personal life, right? Venus is the good things in our life that come to us because we desire them, because we want them and we go after them. I want that ice cream. It's not, oh, here's some ice cream because you did a great job today, and we just want to reward you with ice cream. That's Jupiter. But Venus is like, I want ice cream, so I go out and get ice cream. Mars is very much most of the difficulties that happen with Mars in life have to do with our own rash action and over aggressive or impatient decision making, right? So if we're hasty and we're like, let's say we're driving and we just don't pay attention because we're agitated and aggressive, then we might go through a red light and T-boned or whatever, and that it's more of a night thing, more inner thing. Whereas Saturn would be like the car is slowly, something in the car is slowly deteriorating and you didn't know about it, or maybe you knew about it and you neglected it, but eventually it deteriorates, and then, midway through a light, the car breaks down and, you can't drive anymore. So my point is there's a very powerful spiritual, psychological, philosophical rationale for Sect, and how we can use Sect and understand it in a chart based on this more impersonal, objective sphere of the day versus this subjective, inner emotional sphere of the night. And then, like I read in Rhetorius, Mercury is basically, he can be either sect. He switches in between. And we'll bring this up again when we do a video on something called the joys of the planets. Yeah. But you might want to look up that chart right now, because the joys is very cool, because we've got the diurnal planets above the horizon, the nocturnal below in the joys sequence, and then Mercury's in the ascendant about to rise, right? So he's the dweller between two worlds. And mythologically, Mercury would shepherd souls to the underworld and come back up, right? So he is this dweller between two worlds. And so there's a few different ways to determine Mercury's sect, but for now, we'll just mention the simplest, most direct one, which I like the best. and that is where whether or not Mercury is rising before the sun over the horizon, right? So Mercury will rise, and you'll see him in the morning, and then the sun will come up and obscure the sky, and that's oriental, meaning it's rising before the sun, and that would be a day sect Mercury. But if Mercury is down here, and the sun rises, and then Mercury rises after the sun, so that when the sun sets, right, you would see Mercury appear in the night. That's called Occidental, associated with Western, and it is that would be a nighttime Mercury, for the simple reason, right, that you're seeing Mercury either early in the morning, Oriental, or in the evening, Occidental. So it's very wonderful, nice symbolism, and that's kind of the way to determine Mercury's sect. So I'm going to give it back to you now, man.
Yeah, I think Mercury's, even I use the same thing, Mercury, because I've been having a lot of confusions of how to determine the sect of Mercury, because I was using the influences that Mercury had before, but I think this thing makes more sense, because if you use the influence, Mercury is always under the influence of the sun, and sun is the diurnal planet. So
right.
I think the rising of Mercury makes more sense, which I switched to very recently. And if you want, you can also use the sect for the nodes, where I've written in a recent article where I say that the dispositor of a sect determines the sect of the node itself. So if the dispositor of the sect is a diurnal planet, the node is considered to be a diurnal, and if the dispositor of the sect is nocturnal, so the node is said to be nocturnal. So that's how I think it works very well. That's how I've designed it for myself, and it works very well. So I think it is open for comments and so yeah.
That's really cool. And that's not necessarily something we find in the Hellenistic text, but the great thing about practicing ancient astrology in a modern day is that astrologers have always been innovators. And so by innovating like that and playing with it, you're continuing several thousand-year-old tradition, and you're working with the logic of astrology, which is really cool and stuff. Yeah. So I think, I want to talk about a few other things with Sect, if that sounds good.
Sure. Yeah.
So there's a lot more on Sect, and we're going to do more videos on it. And right now we're just sticking to the most basic aspects of it. So again, when you first use this technique, when you look at a chart, you determine if it's day or night. Okay. And if it's day, right, we have those planets acting a certain way. They're going to be more in touch with the overall theme of the life. That's how I like to think about it. The day planets and the houses and other things that they rule over are going to be like more sort of in line with maybe just the more not conscious aspect of the life, but like sort of it's more like the known path, the known destination. If we think about like if you're on a train or something, or taking a car, right? You know basically how to get from point A to point B, and that's kind of like your day planets. It's this sort of something that's more familiar to you. But the night planets are going to be less familiar to you. They're going to represent things that are a little outside the box, or take you into some other not as familiar dimensions. And of course, that would reverse a night chart for the night, more familiar stuff, and the planets would be a little less familiar. And there's lots of ways that can play out in a chart. And I don't have any examples at the moment, but if you think about astrology as storytelling, right? Like it's as simple as like in a night chart, Jupiter, because Jupiter is out of Sect and Jupiter rules over children, right? Then having children for that person might be a little strange for them, versus maybe a day chart person where Jupiter's in Sect having children, might be less strange. It's not always that cut and dry, but like just being very, very simple with it, you can play with this and see how it works in different charts. And it does work as long as you interpret it holistically. Like, don't just take this one technique. But the point I'm making is that, you know, the planets that don't have sect are feel a little less natural or less familiar for the person. And then again, the houses they rule over, right? And the natural significations they rule over, like Jupiter and children, or if Jupiter rules, you know, the 7th house or something, whatever, or the 8th house, or any house, you know, it's like that thing can be, you might think, oh, it's Jupiter, it's so great, but it's a night chart, so he's a little less comfortable to produce great, wonderful Jupiter things, right? So then he whatever house he rules is going to reflect that, and so on. And you'll see that in a lot of the texts from Hellenistic astrologers and even into the Middle Ages. So I would like to read a quick example from Firmicus Maternus, who was a Sicilian Roman astrologer who's also considered Hellenistic, unless you have something you want to add before I do that.
No, I think you can just go ahead and read the passage.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, this stuff, you know, keep in mind too, this stuff sometimes sounds like very negative. And so, I don't know, maybe we'll have to have another video about that, because it sounds very negative and bleak sometimes, but you have to remember the period of time, and it's a sign of the times as well. But all this stuff can be interpreted much more holistically and even psychologically if you want as well. It doesn't have to be so cut and dry. But so I'm just take one example from this text where he's delineating the planets in the houses. And so he says for Saturn in the 9th house, he says, Saturn in the 9th house will make famous magicians, renowned or temple diviners and astrologers. These are always outstanding in their responses. Some carry on rites of temples or in charge of rituals. Sometimes they become long-haired philosophers, interpreters of dreams. So there's quite a lot in that passage already, but the gist of it is pretty damn positive, actually, pretty cool, pretty empowering. You know, it's not actually typically what we might think of Saturn. But then he goes on to say, Saturn in this house by night indicates wrath of the gods and hatred of emperors. And then he goes on to add some aspects from other planets and whatnot, which I won't get into right now. But the gist of it is we go from famous magicians, renowned philosophers, seers, diviners, outstanding in their responses, to incurring the wrath of the gods and the hatred of the emperors. So it's a pretty stark contrast there between a day Saturn and a night Saturn in the 9th house. And in fact, Firmicus pretty much does this with all the planets in all the houses. He gives what they're like in the day and what they're like in the night. And depending on their sect, right, that depends on how successful they are. Like, for example, I won't read it, but I know from studying the text that Venus in a night chart in the 9th is like wonderful, but in a day chart is really questionable for Firmicus. And same with Jupiter. Jupiter in a day chart in the 9th is like great, like prophetic, you know, favor of the gods. But then in a night chart, it's like, well, he's a charlatan, a false prophet. And so it's really like sect is just really important in these ancient forms of astrology we call Hellenistic. And so, you know, when you start getting into it more and really start playing with it, like see how the planets really change for day and night. I mean, you'll be amazed, really, because at the end of the day, it's just about the planets. Like Chris's book says, it's a qualitative thing. You know, do the planets feel really comfortable and empowered to just be constructive and be sort of themselves as characters, or do they feel kind of like resistance and they're not in the right place and they're kind of in like a weird unknown place, you know? And that's kind of how we can really use sect very holistically and constructively.
Yeah, and as you already said, we should not take sect as a only thing, but sect is a very, very good and a useful and a powerful technique and a tool to differentiate or get some answers to questions that generally don't have answers. Especially in my case, when I see there are things that we don't have answers to in the chart. Okay, Okay, so Jupiter might be in a good dignity, but the manifestation would not actually give such a result. So you can use any technique, but still Sect kind of gives an overview of why a particular planet does well in a particular house based upon the sect in which it is placed in, or why it does not do well when it is placed in a good dignity as well. So it is
Right.
as again we get back to the qualitative differentiation. I think that is a very good way to look at the interpretation of a particular planetary position. So
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, and
And well, sorry, I have
no,
a
no, no,
couple
no,
other things.
no. Yeah, please go on.
Okay, cool. So, to make it, just even a little simpler too, is like think about how, again, the diurnal planets are more impersonal, objective, and they emphasize kind of a going out into the world and participating in the world, right? And why they would be less comfortable to manifest that in a night chart, right? And why night planets in a day chart, they're subjective, they're personal, they're empathetic, and so on. Like, why they're going to be at odds in a day chart. It's very simple, right? Because these things, you don't make something impersonal personal, otherwise you kind of muck it up, right? You don't make something really deeply personal too open and too subject to the judgment of the world. It mucks it up. And the final kind of couple things I wanted to say too is like another way to start really utilizing this technique like right away and experimenting with it is two things. Something called the sect light, right? Where the sun is the sect light in a diurnal chart and the moon is the sect light in a nocturnal chart. And there's a lot of techniques surrounding that, but right now we're just going to mention it and say, find the sect light and then examine the sect light from the perspective of, okay, this is sort of, in a sense, it's like the starting point of everything else in the chart. It's like the energy, the vitality, maybe the motive behind everything else in the chart, in a sense. So it's good to start with the sect light, right? Instead of just going sun, moon, ascendant, which we typically do, like find the sect light and really think about how well it's placed and examine it and what it's doing. And that'll give you kind of the foundation for the basis of the chart and the life and so on. And we'll get into that again in other videos, and it'll make a bit more sense what I mean, but just play with that idea, and look it up, read about it too. But then the other important thing is see if the ascendant lord is having sect or not. That's really important, because like I have found that when the sect, or when the ascendant lord is not of the sect, right, the person can be a little bit more avant-garde or outside the box, or even struggle a bit more, going against the grain and that sort of a thing, versus when it does have sect, right, it might fit in better. So the person might fit in better, or things might flow a little more easily in aspects of their life. So I think that is like, to me, like one of the most important considerations, and it definitely works with Mercury too. I can definitely vouch for that. I won't give away the details of my chart, but I can vouch for that. So it's kind of like, I almost think of it as like, to bring in some modern terminology, having an ascendant lord that's not of the sect in favor is kind of like a Uranian thing. It's almost like what a lot of modern astrologers associate with Uranus. It's like a bit more rebellious in some sense. It goes against the grain. Or you could think of it as a retrograde kind of, like where it's going against the natural flow. So those are just two other ways to get started with it, working with it, and you'll see how awesome it is. And again, it's great for psychological insight as well as predictive insight. It's not limited to one thing.
Yeah, and as you said, psychological insight, the sect and the moon plays a very major role in terms of determining the psychological insight. So if moon is happy, if moon is placed in its own sect, then the psychological sense of a particular native might be in a better mood or much more motivated than a moon in a day chart. So, and we should also take the dignity of the planets into consideration. And
Of course, yeah.
yeah, so I think it's good to start using this technique, and it doesn't matter which form of astrology you practice, but still sect works very well. So yeah. So final thoughts. Done.
I think that'll do it for this video.
Yeah, I think that's it. Probably we'll get back with, not probably, but surely we'll get back with another video on sect with a little bit of example charts if possible, so that it will be even more easier to run through with the concept. So yeah.
Yeah, example charts will be good, and then we also should do a video or two on like additional qualifiers for sect, right? Which we haven't mentioned here, but these are called sect rejoicing conditions, and there's a few of them. There's about 3 or 4 that I can think of off the top of my head, and they sort of just modify sect, because sect, as we've presented it, is a little too cut and dry. It's a little too black and white. So these other sect rejoicing conditions that the Hellenistic astrologers talked about and the medieval astrologers employed heavily, they modify things so that it's not so black and white. It's not so one-dimensional. And that's what's really cool about Hellenistic astrology and any ancient astrology, is there's these subtle layers to things, just like life, right? Nothing in life is black and white. So
yes,
astrology's got to be like that too.
Yeah. So, and I think that's done for this video, and we'll see you next time.
Cool.
How much, Lars?
All right. See you, man.